All right, well, welcome everyone. This is Module 5, Section 4. How and where do you form new relationships? This feels like kind of a weird video to have after we've been talking about the discipleship circle and then giving examples of it in action. And if it doesn't feel weird to you, then well, it does to me at least. But I promise it's intentional. Our goal is to bookend the videos that deal in much greater depth with each of the main points along the discipleship circle with these videos that are going to help you think through where you actually start a discipling relationship and where a discipling relationship ends. Because for most of us, by now we're getting a better framework for how to disciple someone, or at least we're getting to ask and answer some good questions about discipleship. But we kept thinking, so how do we help people know where to even meet people to disciple, and then how does a discipleship relationship actually end? So this video is going to help you think through how and where you form new relationships that could potentially turn into discipleship relationships. And then the last video in this module will look at how you end a discipling relationship. And we're going to talk more about some of these principles of forming new relationships in Module 8, but we thought it would be really good to give you just a quick overview of how and where you start new relationships in this module before you get over to Module 8. All right, so forming new relationships, let's be honest, it can be difficult, it can be scary, it's vulnerable, it can be unpleasant at times, and now that I've inspired you to go form new relationships, let me explain to you what I mean. For a lot of people, especially if you are more introverted in nature, forming new relationships is not an easy thing. One of the things that we hear most often from people who move to Seattle is just simply how difficult it is to meet new people and to form meaningful relationships with them. And I get it. I'm about as extroverted as you could possibly be. I mean, there was one evening when we had been in Seattle for maybe even less than a year, where I was walking around my neighborhood with just several boxes of pizza, knocking on random people's doors, inviting them to my house for dinner. I remember coming home with like 35 people from around our neighborhood, and Laura is looking at me like, "You must be crazy. What are you doing?" See, Laura is far more introverted, and so my extreme extroversion can honestly really stress her out a bit. But even for me, forming new relationships was challenging in that first year. We have this phenomenon that I'm sure is not unique to Seattle, but in Seattle we call it the Seattle freeze, which is the idea that people are very friendly when you first meet them, but then when it comes to depth or even just a second time to hang out with someone, you will often get the freeze out. A friend of ours was actually at a new church, or was at a church when she first moved here, and she met this girl next to her, and they both began talking about how difficult it was to form new friendships and relationships in a place like Seattle. The girl had been here for several months and was telling my friend all about the Seattle freeze. Well, so they exchanged numbers after church, and then my friend began to try to connect with this girl from the church, who over the course of weeks continued to duck my friend. I mean, I feel like that's pretty interesting if you ask me. Even in church it can happen. So how and where do you form new relationships, especially if you are new to a city like ours? Well, I think there are some good strategies, and so let's talk about a few of them. First, a friend of mine, when we first moved here, told me, try everything. And when that doesn't work, try it again. Now, this is the extroverted nature in me that is also combined with an overly aggressive sense of competition, but I view a failed party not as an indictment on who I am, but a challenge to make the people around me actually really like me. Now, obviously that doesn't probably help, but there is a principle at large, and it's the idea of consistency. So that is the first how, or principle, in forming new relationships. Consistency in putting yourself out there is difficult, but it leads to opportunities to practice some of the listening and questions that we've talked about in Module 3. Which leads then to the second principle. which is for you to take an interest in the things that people around you are interested in. I can't tell you how often I hear people bash things like sports or musicals or science, board games, Survivor, or whatever it is because they just simply don't have a personal invested interest in that specific thing. We all have our own interests and hobbies that we love, and it's just natural for us to have those, right? But one of the things that will kill every opportunity for a depth of relationship with a new person is to be critical of their interests and hobbies. Just because it isn't currently an interest of yours doesn't mean that it can't become one. I can't tell you how many interests and things that I've become interested in myself because of the people that I am friends with around me. Things like music. And yes, I am one of those people who has very little interest in music. But everyone around me loves music. Camping is another one. Honestly, just ask Laura sometime if you ever meet Laura how long it took for me to be convinced that camping was actually fun. But everyone in the Northwest loves camping, and so I love camping now. Cooking. I had never cooked before a few years ago, and then we bought our house almost exactly 3 years ago, and I started cooking because a lot of my friends do the cooking in their families. We have actually a professional chef at Missio, and so I have loved to cook now. History. I'm a terrible history student, but my wife is an ancient historian, and I love history. This is just a bit of a pet peeve of mine. But learning new things is a part of our God-given creative ability. To poo-poo on other people's interests is the fastest way to never having a meaningful relationship with that person. So take an interest in what other people are interested in. That's the second principle. And so here are some other more practical ideas for how and where you can form new relationships. And the first is to find a person of peace. And again, we're going to talk about a person of peace more in Module 8. But a person of peace is someone who is easier to form a relationship with, but who also will then unlock all of their relationships for you. We often talk at Missio about fighting for community so that others can fall into community. This is a value of ours. We know how hard forming relationships is in this city. And so at our church, we make a huge effort to fight for community, to forge it, to make it available and accessible so that when new people come in, then they can simply fall into that community with very little effort. Another practical and highly effective way of forming new relationships is by finding a third space. And again, we're going to talk about this in Module 8. But third spaces are your most frequented spaces outside of your home and your place of work. It could be a local gym or coffee shop, a pub, a park, or whatever. Think of the most shows that you've ever watched. They almost all have third spaces that they go to. Seinfeld, they all went to Monk's Cafe, right? In Friends, they go down to the cafe with the couch. In Cheers, it's set up in a bar. Third spaces can also be events like Spartan races or mountain biking or any other kind of hobby. They're things where you find regular and consistent community in them. And again, we're going to talk a lot and unpack this more in Module 8. The better and more consistent you are with putting yourself out there, then the more people you're going to run into that can potentially become people who will enter into a friendship with you. And remember, you meet people because they're human beings worthy of your time and respect and care, not because they're projects meant to be Christianized. People can sniff out whether they are projects from a mile away. But what most people struggle with is forming meaningful community. And again, in Module 8, we're going to talk about how you make those relationships, disciple relationships, so that it doesn't feel awkward, like we're not making projects out of people, but you can still disciple them. And so there you go. There's a few principles for how and where you form new relationships. First is consistency. Consistency is key. Second, take an interest in the other person's interests. Then find a person of peace, and then frequent some third spaces. In the next couple of videos, we're going to talk more about the details of the discipleship circle. And then we're going to have a final video that will be on ending a discipleship relationship.